So, good evening sa ating lahat at pag-uusapan natin ang Book of Ruth. So, alamin po natin kung ano ang nilalaman. At katulad ng sinabi ko ay summary lang po ang ating pag-aaral. Pero kung gusto nyong aralin in detail, meron tayong mga outline na pwede nyong aralin. Okay? So ito yung outline. Ang Book of Ruth actually divided into 4. First, the resolve and return of Ruth in chapter 1, verses 1 to 22. In verses 1 to 5, pinag-uusapan dito yung kanyang background. And then verses 6 to 18, yung kanyang choices. And then verses 19 to 22, yung kanyang pagpunta sa Bethlehem. Pangalawa, the reaping rights of Ruth in chapter 2, 1 to 23. In verses 1 to 3, her right to glean. And verses 4 to 17, the results of her gleaning. In verses 17 to 23, the report of her gleaning. Then number 3, the request of Ruth in chapter 3, verses 1 to 18. Verse 1 to 4, suggested by Naomi. And verses 5 to 9, executed by Ruth. Verses 10 to 18, agreed to by Boaz. Number 4, division, the reward of Ruth in chapter 4, verses 1 to 22. Verses 1 to 12, a husband. So it's talks about a husband. And verses 13 to 17, it talks about son. And then verses 18 to 22, a lineage. Ayan po ang outline ng Book of Ruth. Pwede nyo pong basahin yan using this outline para mayroon lang po kayong guide at ano ba ang nangyayari. So, another na pwede nating i-consider in chapter 1. Okay, in chapter 1, here the sitting, it's regarding the judges and turbulent times. So chapter 1 ay may kinalaman ito sa mga pagpipili ni Ruth. Na-mention dito si Naomi and Ruth. In verse 9, chapter 1, may the Lord grant that you may find rest. Ayan, in chapter 2, it's actually the service of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz. Dito po na-mention sa chapter 2. So Naomi had a kinsman whose name was Boaz in verse 1. And then chapter 3, it's about the claim or the claim of Ruth. In verse 18, wait until you know how the matter turns. And then chapter 4, Ruth's marriage with Boaz. Boaz and Ruth, a mutual love. In verse 13, Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. Ayan po, din sa chapter 4:14, blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today. So actually it was mentioned in 1 Samuel regarding the changes of time. Now, kung pag-usapan natin ang 1:1, ito yung setting in Ruth chapter 1 verse 1. Now, it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land. So about the circumstances, ito po, makikita natin ang circumstances dyan sa diagram. Kung makikita nyo, lose deeper commitment, and sa chapter 1, chapter 2 yan. Pagdating sa chapter 3 to chapter 4, gain deeper love. So yun yung issue. Sa chapter 1, chapter 2, ito yung nangyari kay Ruth. And then sa chapter 3 and 4. So how about emotion in chapter 1, chapter 2? So nagkaroon siya ng tinatawag na grief, and then loneliness. Chapter 1, grief, and then chapter 2, loneliness. So it was happen that time. Pagdating sa chapter 3 and chapter 4, anong nangyari kay Ruth? Nagkaroon siya ng companionship, then rejoicing in chapter 4. So ano ang theme or tema ng book na ito? Redemption. God provides for those who trust Him in hard times. So ang picture ni Christ na matatagpuan natin, ito nga yung kinsman redeemer. So anong ibig sabihin? Itong Book of Ruth ay pinag-uusapan din dito. Ang tawag din is an addendum to Judges. So when it comes of authorship, as with Judges, the author is uncertain. Though Jewish tradition points to Samuel, this is unlikely, however, since the author of Ruth mentions David, and Samuel died before David's coronation in chapter 4, 17, and then verse 22. So ito ay according sa tradition na si Samuel ang nai-suggest na author, pero actually uncertain ang author ng Book of Ruth. So about dating, probably 1000 BC. So the title of the Book of Ruth, gets its name from one of its main characters, a young woman of Moab, the great-grandmother of David, and one who is in the genealogical line of the Savior in Matthew chapter 1 verse 5. Kung babasahin natin ang Mateo chapter 1 verse 1:5, and Salmon begat Boaz of Rahab, and Boaz begat Obed of Ruth, and Obed begat Jesse. Ayan po yung lineage. And another book of the Bible named after a woman is Esther. So what are the theme and purpose? So Ruth is the story of a couple in Israel who, during a time of famine, moved to Moab. And there, the husband and his 2 sons died, leaving the mother, Naomi, alone with her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. Naomi decided to move back to Israel, and Ruth insisted on returning with her. Once in Israel, they turned to a relative by the name of Boaz for help. Eventually, Ruth married Boaz. So, like a brilliant diamond against black velvet, Ruth sparkles against the dark days of the book of Judges. Ruth is the story of loyalty, purity, and love in a day when anarchy, selfishness, and depravity was generally the rule. So tandaan po natin, pinag-aralan natin yung regarding sa judges, okay, yung mga deliverer, pero ito ay after doon sa judges, yung mga deliverer, ito po ang nagiging scenario. Such Ruth serves as a positive pictures of faith and obedience in the midst of apostasy and shows how such faith brings blessing. Ruth also serves as an important link in the ancestry of King David and, as mentioned, is found in the line of Messiah. So alam po natin yan. Doon galing kay Ruth yung linya ng Mesias. Si David doon din sa kay Ruth. Kumbaga, iisang line lang yung kay David at yung kay Jesus Christ. So ulitin ko, Ruth also serves as an important link in the ancestry of King David and, as mentioned, is found in the line of Messiah. And then other purposes of Ruth are seen in the way it illustrates the truths of the kinsman redeemer. So sino yung kinsman redeemer na mention doon sa Ruth? Ito ay referring to Boaz. Ayan, the presence of a godly remnant even in times of great apostasy. So nagkaroon ng great apostasy after doon sa mga judges, nagkaroon ng great apostasy, at ito naman ang good news, mayroong isang godly remnant, at ito'y referado naman kay Boaz. And God's faithfulness to those who will walk with Him by faith. Since Ruth was a Gentile, the book illustrates God's desire to bring the Gentile world into the family of God. So ginamit, di ba? At ito naman ay related doon sa Abrahamic covenant. Yan, so related ito doon sa Abrahamic covenant. So ibig sabihin, may mga record na ang mga Gentiles ay nabiyayaan or nabless sa pamagitan ng mga Israelites. Pero hindi ibig sabihin na ito ay connected sa dispensation of grace. Hindi po. Okay? Hindi po connected sa dispensation of grace na may mga Gentiles na ligtas. Noon, may mga Gentiles na ligtas through Israelites. At isa nga dito si Ruth. It may seem surprising that one who reflects God's love so clearly is a Moabite. At isa doon si Ruth. Galing siya sa Moab. Yet her complete loyalty to the Israelite family into which she has been received by marriage and her total devotion to her desolate mother-in-law mark her as a true daughter of Israel and a worthy ancestress of David. She strikingly exemplifies the truth that participation in the coming kingdom of God is decided not by blood and birth, but by the conformity of one's life to the will of God through the obedience that comes from faith. Her place in the ancestry of David signifies that all nations will be represented in the kingdom of David's greater son. And kailan ito mangyayari? Sa millennium, sa millennial reign ng ating Panginoon, yung mga propesiya regarding sa paghahari ni Kristo bilang kapalit doon sa trono ni David ay mangyayari po sa second coming. So kung pag-usapan natin ang mga keywords, kinsman mentioned 14 times. And the word redeem mentioned 9 times. And thoughts or a key term would be kinsman redeemer. Mayroon pong tinatawag na mayroon po silang tinatawag na law when it comes of a redeemer. Mayroon silang mga batayan, basihan, paano nila i-redeem yung tao. So mayroong able to redeem, mayroong willing to redeem. So may mga may mga batas regarding sa kinsman redeemer. Katulad ni Boaz, siya ay willing to redeem. Ayan, siya ay willing to redeem. Kaya tinubos niya si Ruth. What are the key verses in this book? Verses 15 to 17 in chapter 1, then she said, "Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." Verse 16, "But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." Verse 17, "Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me." So, ang tindi po yung commitment ni Ruth. Then, verses 11 to 13, chapter 3, "And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask. For all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence." Then verse 12, "And now it is true I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I." Verse 13, "Remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning." Ganun po yung naging scenario nan sa chapter 3, 11 to 13. And then, key chapters. And chapter 1 is a key chapter because it demonstrates Ruth's decision of faith, devotion, and commitment to stay with Naomi, a decision that lead to her redemption. Then another key chapter, chapter 4, because in this chapter, Ruth goes from being a widow and poverty to marriage and wealth through the kinsman redeemer. And are the key person or key people. Yes, Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. So, titignan natin si Christ dito sa book na ito, Christ as seen in this book. So, in the Old Testament, if a person or an state were sold into bondage, they could be redeemed if certain requirements were met by what is called the kinsman redeemer. So, ito yung na-mention natin. Mayroon siyang law of redeemer or kinsman redeemer. Mayroon silang sinusundan or goal or close relative. Kung maaari, first na i-consider nila para ma-redeem yung isang tao ay ang close relative, and then kung hindi kaya ng close relative, yung distant relative, and then yung willing to redeem. So, this is as perfect illustrations of the redemptive work of the Savior. So, the word goal must, number 1, be a blood relative. So, ganun yung yun yung ang talagang rule para ma-redeem yung isang tao, be a blood relative of those he redeems. Puntahan natin at babasahin natin ang Deuteronomy 25 verse 5. If brethren dwell together and one of them die and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her and take her to him to wife, and perform the duty of an husband's brother unto her. So yun yung ikino-consider at part ng kautusan na halimbawa yung husband namatay, yung brother ang aasawahin ng brother yung asawa ng kanyang kapatid. Redeem ang tawag doon. Yun yung redeemer. He redeemed niya. Ganun din sa verse 7 to 10, chapter 25. And if the man like not to take his brother's wife, halimbawa kung hindi, ayaw niya, then let his brother's wife go up to the gate unto the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to raise up unto his brother a name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Then, sa verse 8, then the elders of his city shall call him and speak unto him, and if he stand to it and say, I like not to take her, ayaw niya, refuse. So, verse 9, then shall his brother's wife come unto him in the presence of the elders, and loose his shoe from of his foot, and speak in his face, and shall answer and say, so shall it be done unto that man that will not build up his brother's house. Verse 10, and his name shall be called in Israel the house of him that hath his shoe loose. So may yun yung first na consideration also under the law ay dapat blood relative o magkapatid, kung baga magkapatid. Then pangalawa, be able to pay the price of redemption. So dapat able. So ang una dapat brother or blood related, and pangalawa is able to pay the price of redemption. Doon tayo balik tayo sa chapter 2 ng Book of Ruth. Chapter 2 verse 1. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. So, able to pay the price of redemption. Ito nga ang nangyari. So, hindi kaya yung brother, blood-related, o relative. So, proceed to pangalawa, able to pay the price of redemption. Yan. Then, aside from able to pay, dapat willing to redeem or pay the price. So, ganito ang nangyari kay Boaz. Mayroon siyang kaya, he was able to pay the price of redemption, then he was willing to redeem or pay the price. Chapter 3 verse 11. And now, my daughter, fear not, I will do to thee all that thou requires, for all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman. So, ganon ang ginawa ni Boaz. So, be free himself as Christ. So, ito yung picture. Yan, he was a picture of our Lord Jesus Christ. As Christ was free from the curse of sin, being without sin in 2 Corinthians 5:21, diba? Na-mention na si Kristo walang kasalanan, pero siya nagiging makasalanan para tayo maibilang na righteous. So, yun ang illustration na makikita natin doon sa scenario. So, why is Ruth so important? The book was written from Naomi's point of view. Every event related back to her. Her husband's and son's death, her daughters-in-law, her return to Bethlehem, her God, her relative, Boaz, her land to sell, and her progeny. Almost without fear, in Scripture, the story views God through the eyes of a woman. Naomi has been compared to a female Job. She lost everything: home, husband, and sons, and even more than Job did, her livelihood. She joined the ranks of Israel's lowest members. So the poor and the widowed. She cried out in her grief and neglected to see the gift that God placed in her path. Ruth. So Ruth herself embodied loyal love, her moving vow of loyalty. In chapter 1, 16 to 17, and Ruth said, entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest I will go, and where thou lodgest I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. And verse 17, where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. So the Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. Ayan. So, ganun katindi yung kanyang loyalty. So, though obviously not marital in nature, is often included in modern wedding ceremonies to communicate the depths of devotion to which the new couples aspire. So ito mostly ginagamit sa mga itong verses na ito, di ba? Sa mga wedding ceremonies. Itong Ruth chapter 1:16 to 17 dahil doon sa kanyang vow of loyalty. So the book reveals the extent of God's grace. He accepted Ruth into his chosen people and honored her with a rule in continuing the family line into which his appointed king, David, and later his son Jesus would be born according to Matthew chapter 1, verse 1 and then verse 5. So what's the big idea? Obedience in everyday life pleases God. So when we reflect His character through our interactions with others, we bring glory to Him. Ruth's sacrifice and hard work to provide for Naomi reflected God's love. So Boaz's loyalty to his kinsman, Naomi's husband, reflected God's faithfulness. And Naomi's plan for Ruth's future reflected selfless love. So that's the big idea. So the book of Ruth showed the Israelites the blessings that obedience could bring. It showed them the loving, faithful nature of their God. So this book demonstrates that God responds to His people's cry. So mayroong tinatawag significant doon sa mga Israelites itong book of Ruth. He practices what he preaches. So to speak, watching him provide for Naomi and Ruth, two widows with little prospects for a future. And we learn that he cares for the outcasts of society just as he asked us to do. May na-mention sa Jeremiah regarding dito sa widows. Jeremiah 22:16. Verse 16, he judged the cause of the poor and needy. Then it was well. With him was not this tsunami, saith the Lord. And then in James 1:27, James chapter 1:27, pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their afflictions and to keep himself unspotted from the world. So this short story is a brilliant work of theological art that invites us to reflect on the questions of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. So there are three main characters in this book: Naomi, the widow; Ruth, the Moabite; and Boaz, the Israelite farmer. So their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. And let's dive in and see what unfolds. Ruth in chapter 1, introducing Naomi and Ruth, opens with the line, in the day when the judges ruled, in Ruth chapter 1 verse 1. So this reminds us of the dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And we find an Israelite family in Bethlehem, Elimelech, Naomi, and their sons, Mahlon and Chilion, struggling to survive through a famine in search of food, and they move into the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. Diba doon sa Judges na pag-usapan natin yung mga Moabites, Ammonites, Canaanites, and then sila yung mga kalaban ng mga Israelites that time during the time of Joshua, and even during the time of Joshua mayroong command na dapat ipaalisin sila doon sa promised land, pero ang ginawa ng Israel ay hindi nila ginawa yon. So ang nangyari, ang mga Israelites ay naimpluwensyahan doon sa paniniwala ng mga Canaanites, Moabites, at ito nga ay si Ruth, isang Gentile, ay galing doon sa lugar na yon. At ang kagandahan naman dito, si Ruth ay naging believer. Kung ano yung pinaniniwalaan ng Israel ay pinaniniwalaan din niya. So there the father Elimelech dies, and the sons marry Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. The sons soon follow after their father and die as well, leaving only Naomi and her daughters-in-law with no reason to stay. Naomi tells them that she's moving back home. She knows the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be hard, so she compels them to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi, saying in Ruth 1:16, "Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." So the two of them return to Israel, and then chapters concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter, as she laments her tragic fate. How about chapter 2? So in chapter 2 may record na nagkita itong si Ruth at saka si Boaz. Begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where to find food. Ito na nga ang scenario kung saan sila kukuha ng pagkain, and it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. So Ruth goes out and happens to end up picking grain in the field of Naomi's relative, Boaz, who we're told is a man of noble character. He noticed Ruth, and after finding out about her story, shows remarkable generosity. He makes a special provisions for the immigrant Ruth to gather in his field, just as the Torah commands in Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24, verse 19. When thou cuttest down thine harvest in thy field, and hast for God a sheaf in the field, so thou shalt not go again to fetch it. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hand. So, ganun po ang nangyayari. Nagkataon na harvest, di ba? So, may mga natitira at yun ang kinukuha ni Ruth. Dahil mayroong command. It was commanded ng ating Panginoon na talagang nag-iiwan talaga sila for the strangers. Yan, ganun po ang utos ng Panginoon that time. At nung sa time ni Ruth, nagkataon na harvest nung kanilang pinuntahan with Naomi doon sa kanyang relative, at ganun po ang kanyang ginawa para sila ay makakain. So Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi that he prays God will reward her for her boldness. And after Ruth comes home that day, Naomi finds out that she met Boaz and she's thrilled. Boaz is their family redeemer. This praise refers to a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and left behind a wife, it was the Redeemer's responsibility to marry the widow and protect the family. And Naomi begins to hope that perhaps there is still a future for her family. So ganun ang scenario. So sino ang nagiging kinsman redeemer? Si Boaz. Siya ang naging kinsman redeemer. Bakit? Ayon sa batas din ay dapat able to pay and willing to pay the price. At ito nga ang nangyari. Si Boaz ang kinsman redeemer. And then chapter 3, so Ruth asked Boaz to marry her. And then starts with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. And Ruth will stop wearing the clothes of a grieving widow and show that she's available to be married again. Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm at night. As she approaches, Boaz wakes up startled, but Ruth makes her intentions clear, asking if Boaz will redeem the family and marry her. So that's the issue of chapter 3. And Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family and calls Ruth a woman of noble character. So yung character, no? Yung kaniyang loyalty, so nagustuhan ni Boaz, and he tells her to wait until the next day. So when he will redeem Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders, Ruth returns to Naomi where they marvel together at the night's events. How about in chapter 4? As a conclusion and the role of God in the story. So it all comes together. So it turns out that there is a closer family member than Boaz who is also interested in redeeming the family, but at the last minute, he finds out he has to marry Ruth the Moabite and declines. So Boaz, on the other hand, knows Ruth's true character, and he acquires the family property of Naomi's husband and marries Ruth. Just as Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so too was Boaz loyal to their family. The story concludes with a total reversal of all the tragedies from chapter 1. The deaths of sons and husbands are reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to her and Naomi. This symmetry becomes even more remarkable. So the opening tragedy, followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth, is matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. So ano po ang nangyari? Nagkaroon ng restoration. Sino ang kinsman redeemer? Si Boaz. Di ba dapat blood related, since na ang isa pang rule ng law of kinsman redeemer ay kung hindi kaya nung kapatid ay yung distant relative na mayroong at saka mayroong kakayanan at willing na i-redeem. So yun yung kautusan that time. Kaya ganun ang nangyari. Kaya si Ruth ay na-redeem. So na-restore. Okay? At si Boaz ang kinsman redeemer. All this highlights the designs of the internal chapters as well. It begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future, followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz, concluded by Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what has taken place. The story is beautifully written, and this literary design actually connects with an interesting feature of the story, how little God is mentioned. The characters talks about God a few times, but the narrator hardly ever mentions God explicitly doing anything in the story. This is its subtle brilliance, because God's providence is at work behind every scene, weaving together the lives of the characters. While Naomi's tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, and we discover he's actually on a mission to restore her. So, and God accomplishes that restoration through Ruth's boldness and loyalty. The reason why Ruth's action brings healing to her and Naomi's life is because of Boaz, a no-nonsense farmer who is full of generosity and loyalty. The story is literary exploration of the interplay between God's purposes and human decisions. God waves together the faithful obedience of His people to bring about His redemptive purposes. So this leads into the actual end of the book, so which is not a story. So the book concludes with a genealogy that shows how Boaz and Ruth's son, Obed. Sino yung anak nila? Si Obed. Was the grandfather of King David. Okay? Si Obed ay grandfather ni David. Sino ba yung father ni David? Si Jesse. So from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. So ganun, doon, yun na yung na-mention sa Matthew chapter 1 and 5. So doon nanggagaling. Yung isang linya lang. All of a sudden, the seemingly mundane events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. So the small story of Ruth is taken up in the larger story of God's purpose, and in this way, the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in our own lives as well. So the book of Ruth is named for the Moabite woman who commits herself to the Israelite people by an oath to her mother-in-law, Naomi, and becomes the great-grandmother of David by marriage to Boaz of Bethlehem. So thus, she is an ancestor in the messianic line that leads to Jesus. In chapter 1 verse 5, the book of Matthew. So nakuha niyo po yung connection. Ayan. Kung bakit napakahalaga yung Book of Ruth, dahil doon nanggaling, yun yung linya ng Mesyas. Yun ang linya ng Panginoong Hesus. Doon kaya mahalaga na mapag-aralan, maunawaan natin yung Book of Ruth. So the book portrays the love and loyalty of human beings in working their way through tragic circumstances to participation in the community of the faithful people of God. The key is responsible and loving decision making. Ruth's loyalty in chapter 2, verse 11. Again, verse 11, and Boaz answered and said unto her, It hath fully been showed me all that thou hast done unto thy mother-in-law since the death of thine husband, and how thou hast left thy father and thy mother, and the land of thy nativity, and art come unto a people which thou knewest not heretofore. So her generosity in chapter 1, 15 to 17, the book of Ruth, and chapter 2, verse 2. And Ruth the Moabites said unto Naomi, Let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, Go, my daughter. And then verse 7. So in her willingness to take risk for the sake of righteousness, set in motion a chain of beneficial events, while behind the scenes God blesses each step in the developing drama. Ruth is so frequently designated the Moabite in the book that the audience of the story is constantly reminded of the universality of the embrace of salvation. So in the Greek and Latin canons, Ruth follows Judges. Kaya pala yun yung arrangement doon. After ng Judges, yung Ruth, according to the Greek and Latin canons, to which it is related by its opening time reference once back in the time of the Judges, and precedes Samuel, serving as transition from Israel as a tribal union to monarchy. So tandaan natin yung Judges, actually na-mention natin, na pag-aralan natin na ito'y bridging the gap. Bridging the gap from yung Judges. Okay, yung Book of Judges. From Joshua to the Judges. And then to the monarchy. So here, serving as transition. Okay, ulitin ko. Serving as transition or bridging from Israel as a tribal union to monarchy. So in the present sequence of the Hebrew canon, it is placed among the writings immediately after the book of Proverbs, which ends with a powerful portrayal of the woman of words in Proverbs chapter 31, 10 to 31. And then Ruth 3:11. Verse 11, and now, my daughter, fear not, I will do to thee all that thou requires, for all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman. Ruth is the primary liturgical text in Judaism for the celebration of the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot. Ayan ang isang mahalaga din yan sa mga Jewish or sa mga Judaism that time, kaya na-mention doon sa book na ito. So the beauty of the story's construction, its use of dialogue, nearly 2/3 of the text, and the sheer drama of its content mark it as one of the classic short stories of world literature. Based on the recollection of an historical figure. Kaya nga itong Book of Ruth ay isinama doon sa tinatawag historical book. Based on the recollections of an historical figure, a story is developed which grips its audience with profound insight into divine and human relationships. The story is presented from a point some time after the course of events, as is indicated by the explanation of an obscure custom in chapter 4, verse 7. Now, this was the manner in former time in Israel concerning redeeming and concerning changing. For to confirm all things, a man plucked up his shoe and gave it to his neighbor, and this was a testimony in Israel. So wherever and whenever it was told, its claim of God's universal concern for humankind, the attractiveness of caring human responsibility shines forth. So the dates of composition is disputed. Many authors date it early in the monarchy, and valid arguments can be presented for that position, and others argue for a post-exilic date. So may mga kumbaga debatable, may mga discussion arguments when it comes of date of kung kailan isinulat. May mga arguments na nangyari. So yung iba ay sa post-exilic. They see the favorable presentation of a Moabite woman who became David's grandmother as a counter to the stringent measures of Israel and Nehemiah against marriage with Moabites and other non-Jews. According to Ezra chapter 9 to 10 and Nehemiah chapter 13, 23 to 29. Okay? So may mga record na may hindi pwede na ganon ang mangyayari. Pwede nating i-consider itong mayroong 10 or 10 powerful lessons from the book of Ruth. Lesson number 1, loss is hard. Alam naman natin na yung nangyari sa pamilya ni Ruth, di ba? Namatay yung husband niya at yung mga anak at siya na lang naiwan at yung kanyang in-law. So, the book of Ruth starts with the life of Naomi. Naomi was from Bethlehem and moved to Moab with her husband Elimelech and 2 sons. Sino yun? Yung kanyang 2 sons, si Malon and Kilion. Okay, si Naomi was from Bethlehem at pumunta sa Moab kasama ang kanyang asawa, si Elimelech, at mayroon silang ilang anak? 2. And Naomi later on lost her husband. So namatay yung husband niya and she was left with her 2 sons. And her 2 sons found wives. Ito na nga. Kaya si Naomi ay kanyang yun nga, in-law. Kasi yung isa sa mga in-law niya, ito si Ruth and Orpah. But 10 years later, both sons died as well. Ganun po. Kaya ang nangyari, itong si Ruth, sumama na lang doon sa kanyang in-law, si Naomi. Talk about a hard time, right? It was then that Naomi decided to return back home to the land of Judah. So, nag-decide si Naomi na bumalik, pero sumama si Ruth sa kanya, na kahit saan man siya, sasama na lang siya. So, because Naomi had lost her husband and sons, she was moving back home to Bethlehem as a widow. Her heart and life had crumbled. This is a reminder that loss and change are hard, and unfortunately, it's more common than we know. Many times, while dealing with grief, we can feel lost or forgotten. Naomi knew all too well how that felt. Naramdaman niya lahat, kalungkutan, yung kanyang emotion, lahat na yung dahil sa sitwasyon. And so, another lesson, number 2, keep your commitments. Ruth and Orpah were both given the blessing from Naomi to go back to their hometowns after their husbands had passed. Naomi knew she couldn't provide the women with new husbands, and she wanted them to take the obvious choice for moving forward for another marriage if it was God's will. Orpah took the option, but Ruth decided to stay. Kaya naghiwalay na sila. So, ang mas pinili ni Ruth na magstay with Naomi and head to Bethlehem together. So, separate, hindi nila kasama si Orpah, nag-opposite direction ang pinunta niya. Then, magkasama si Naomi and Ruth. Kaya, sa verse 16, yung binasa nga natin, yung sabi niya, ang sabi ni Ruth, where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. So, di ba? Ganon ang nangyari. How many times have we made choices to be in place that we think will give us what we want? Ruth was brave in keeping her commitment to Naomi, staying with her instead of looking to her own interest. Ayan, so commitment. It actually talks about the commitment na po. And number 3 na lesson dito sa Book of Ruth, bitterness happens. So when Naomi and Ruth made it to Bethlehem, townswomen stated, "Can this be Naomi?" Basahin lang natin Ruth 1:19. So they too went until they came to Bethlehem, and it came to pass, when they were come to Bethlehem, that all the city was moved about them, and they said, "Is this Naomi?" But when Naomi, which name means pleasant. So yan yung ibig sabihin ng kanyang pangalan, pleasant. Heard, she answered with, "Don't call me Naomi." She told them, "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." In chapter 1:21, "And she said unto them, Call me not Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Why then call ye me Naomi, seeing the Lord hath satisfied against me, and the Almighty hath afflicted me." So needless to say, Naomi was upset, and she knew that she had been blessed to have her husband and sons. And then she felt like God just took everything away from her. Kaya nga parang hinalin tulad siya kay Job. Yung kanyang buhay, di ba? Siya na lang Wala na yung kanyang husband, mga anak, nawala, mag-isa na lang niya. Kaya hinahalin tulad siya, ito si Naomi sa buhay ni Job. Ayan, so returning to her hometown, she felt less than empty and bitter for what had happened to her. And have you ever felt that way? Bitter and mad at God for what may feel like a ruined life. So ganon ang actually yung scenario dito kay Naomi. Buti na lang sinamahan siya ni Ruth, kanyang in-law, at mayroon silang agreement or usapan. Number 4 na reason dito sa Book of Ruth, get to work. Yun yung sinabi doon. When they had reached their new home, Ruth decided to get to work. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi in Ruth chapter 2 verse 2, "Let me go to the fields." Kumbaga siya yung pumunta doon, siya yung nag-volunteer and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. She was in a new town with new people and wanted to help take care of Naomi and herself. She decided to glean in a nearby field and follow the harvest or harvesters. Her work ethic did not go unnoticed as a foreman would speak about her labor to Boaz shortly after his notice of her. In Ruth chapter 2 verse 7, she's been at it steady ever since, from early morning until now, without so much as a break. Wow, ang tindi no, halos whole day siya doon na kumukuha ng pagkain para sa kanila. Number 5, the man noticed first. Ayan, dito sa scenario na ito. God had orchestrated Ruth's location into Boaz's presence. She was minding her own business, looking to pick up leftover grain when he came into her life, and Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters in chapter 2 verse 5, who does that young woman belong to? Many times as single, I wonder, ito po yung ayon sa isang commentator, okay, as itong sabi niya, I wonder if I am doing my best to meet available men, or ayan, here we see the Ruth was working, probably sweaty and soiled from the day's work, and was not trying to get anyone's attention, but God made sure that it was gained by the right man at the right time. Ganun po ang kumbaga yung love story na nila Ruth and Boaz. Then number 6 na lesson dito sa Book of Ruth, honorable intention. So after her introduction, Boaz tells Ruth to not glean in another field and don't go away from her. In chapter 2 verse 8, stay here with the women who work for me. And later on in the chapter, we understand more fully how much Boaz's first reaction of Ruth was to protect her, as Naomi explains, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, according to Ruth chapter 2 verse 22, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So Boaz's first reaction to Ruth was not in charm, but in protection. Number 7, she made a move. Naomi wanted Ruth to find a home where she can be provided for. Naomi believed Boaz to be the guardian's redeemer. So, kumbaga si Naomi ay nakita niya yung mangyayari or yung sa kinabukasan ni Ruth with Boaz. So Naomi believed Boaz to be the guardian redeemer in her family line. She told Ruth to get dressed up in her best clothes and perfume and go to Boaz. Ruth did just that. She let Boaz know of her interest by lying at his feet after he had fallen asleep. When he woke up and asked what she was doing, she stated in Ruth chapter 3 verse 9, I am your servant Ruth. she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. So it talks about letting a man know you are interested. In number 8, lesson number 8, noble character is important. As Ruth went to Boaz to ask for his covering, he knew there was another man in line ahead of him for Naomi's land. He stated that if the man wanted to be her guardian redeemer, then he would have the rights to her land and her hand. But if not, then Boaz was more than happy to oblige. He didn't let Ruth just leave after their conversation in the middle of the night to protect her reputation, because she was a woman of noble character. He was a gentleman even in a vulnerable position and did the right thing. She rested at his feet until dawn and left when no one would notice her. On top of that, he didn't let her leave empty-handed, as he gave her and Naomi 6 measures of barley. Napansin niyo po yung instead na kumbaga nung pumunta sila dito, wala silang idea na ganun ang mangyayari. Hindi nila alam kung saan sila kukuha ng pagkain, pero nung napunta sila doon ay iba doon sa kanilang inaasahan. Mas marami palang blessing, marami palang food na or maraming supply kumbaga. Ayan. Number 9, he takes care of business. Before getting too taken by emotions and excited about Ruth's interest in him, Boaz made sure that the right thing was done first. So Naomi wanted to sell a piece of land that belonged to Elimelech, and whoever bought the land would also acquire Ruth's hand for the land in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. Although Boaz was in line for the rights of the land, so there was another guardian redeemer that had first dibs. Boaz talked to guardian redeemer himself, and as it turned out, that man did not want the land and Ruth. So this gave Boaz the go-ahead, and he declared theirs to buy the land and take Ruth as his wife. So ganun po. May mga kasi meron silang rules or batas na sinusunod, kaya may kino-consider sila kung talagang mayroong mag-redeem kay Ruth, pero walang qualified. So si Boaz yung final. Siya ay able and willing to redeem Ruth. At sa madaling salita, si Ruth ay naging asawa ni Boaz. In number 10, our decisions matter. After Boaz purchased the land and acquired Ruth's hand in marriage, they became pregnant with a son, and this son was named Obed, who later became the father of Jesse, who later became the father of David, who, as we know, is in the direct family line of Jesus Christ. How awesome to see how the braveness and commitments of a young woman would later meet a man that would help to bring the family lines of Jesus Christ. Diba? So yun ang yung na makita nating background. Yan po yung line ng ating Panginoon. So from doon kay sa love story ni Ruth and Boaz, ay yun pala ang pinanggalingan din ng ating Panginoong Hesus. God also brought joy back to Naomi as she lovingly helped to take care of Obed. How awesome is our God that He can take such a dark and lonely seasons for Naomi and Ruth and turn it into joy, love, and prosperity. Pero hindi ganon yung kanilang ini-expect nung bumalik sila doon o nung pumunta sa Bethlehem. Hindi ganon yung ang kanilang naramdaman eh. Pero nga, ang Panginoon ay mayroong plano. So yung kanilang ini-expect na unexpected turn into joy, love, and prosperity. Never underestimate the power of your decisions, commitment, humility, and integrity with the help of God. So dito po ay makikita natin yung work ng Panginoon. Siyempre, ang Panginoon ay alam na ng Panginoon yun. Okay, alam ng Panginoon na si Ruth ang gagamitin, instrument na maipanganak, na doon maipanganak ang Mesyas. How about si Orpah? So na-mention si Orpah, lives but Ruth stays in verses 6 to 15. Naomi did finally decide to return to the land. Diba sa verse 21 to 22? Although her faith was somewhat running on low, it was not gone. She heard that the Lord had visited in verse 6, and so she arose in verse 6, and she returned to the house of bread empty at the time of the harvest. Naomi made a difficult decision to leave Moab and return to Bethlehem. Several factors could have discouraged her from returning, including she could have been afraid to face her people back in Bethlehem and perhaps receive their criticism or disapproval. Siyempre, ang kasama niya isang Moabite, maraming kritiko na pwedeng kanyang matanggap. Maraming critics na pwede niyang matanggap pagbalik niya sa Jerusalem. It is generally easier to stay where one is than move, and doing nothing is easier than doing something. Leaving Moab meant leaving behind whatever they had built there, such as a house, farm, and friends. It also ended up meaning leaving Orpah. It should be noted that Naomi was completely committed to returning to Israel. Bumalik siya doon even when she believed it would cost her both of her daughters-in-law, all her remaining family. She still was strong in her resolve to return. Kasama niya si Ruth. Lesson from Orpah. Tignan natin kung anong lesson naman kay Orpah. Si Orpah hindi nila kasama, pero ito din ay daughter-in-law din ni Naomi. Orpah seems to be a very good daughter-in-law. She seems to be willing to go with Naomi. In verse 7, she departed together with Naomi. And even after Naomi tried to persuade her to stay, she still insisted to go with her in verse 10. Only after Naomi convinced her a second time did she return to the land. So kaya doon sa ibang mga chapter ng Book of Ruth, hindi na kasama itong si Orpah. So Ruth expresses her loyalty verses 16 to 18. In these verses, we see one of the best expressions of commitment. Anywhere in the Bible, we see Ruth's loyalty toward Naomi. Even deeper than that, we see here belief in and conversion by the Lord. In verse 17, she invokes the name of God. This was the covenant name he used to reveal himself to his people, the Israelites. It was unusual for non-Jews to refer to God by this special covenant name. Instead, they often use a more general name for God or a descriptor like the kings in Daniel who called him the God of heaven. Ruth use of this name suggests that she has not only committed herself to Naomi, but she has also committed herself to the Lord. Ayan po. In verse 16, she also states this, saying that your God shall be my God. So Naomi was not perfect, but it is still clear her life and example had a big impact on Ruth. So a short side lesson from this is that God can use even imperfect sinners to draw others to himself. These verses show so many beautiful character qualities of Ruth that we should aspire to. Number 1, committed. 2, decisive, loyal, good communicator, and perseverance. So Naomi is bitter. In a small village, news travels fast. It didn't take long before all the people in Bethlehem knew that Naomi was back. Fear of criticism from such people who probably were not above being busy buddies could have discouraged Naomi from returning, but she came back anyway. So Naomi returned, but her attitude was still not right. She changed her name to Mara, di ba? Dahil nga doon sa na-mention natin, nawala lahat sa kanya, siya na lang siya na lang naiwan at kasama nga niya si Ruth, at yun, pinalitan niya yung pangalan niyang Mara. Kaya yung bumalik siya doon, kilala siya as Naomi, pero sabi niya, wag niya akong tawaging Naomi, ako na si Mara. Dahil doon sa, syempre yung sitwasyon. Ayaw sana niyang bumalik doon sa Bethlehem dahil alam niya na may mga kritiko, pero bumalik pa rin siya doon sa kanilang lugar. So rather than turning back to the Lord with his sweet spirit, she was still holding on to some bitter things about what had happened. So a person cannot truly be restored to the Lord and be filled until they deal with and repent of the wrong emotions inside of them. So ang ginawa niya, na-realize niya later on, so in-acknowledge pa rin niya ang Panginoon. Ngayon, Ruth begins gleaning Boaz field, di ba, sa Ruth chapter 1, chapter 2. And Ruth takes initiative. Ruth and Naomi have returned to the land, and first thing Ruth is recorded as doing is volunteering to go and glean, and she doesn't wait around for someone to come and rescue or serve her. So Ruth sees what needs to be done, and thus it was already the time of the harvest, and Naomi and Ruth had certainly not been able to plant and grow a crop so quickly. So ganon, nagkataon na may harvest para sila makakain. Kumuha siya ng mga tira-tirang yung sa harvest, yung mga naiwan doon sa mga harvest, at yun yung kanilang source para sila ay makakain. So Boaz extends kindness to Ruth naman in verses 8 to 16. And Boaz is generous. He does not try to hoard his crop or make sure that he makes the most possible profit out of his field. So tinulungan pa rin itong si Ruth para sila'y makakain with her mother-in-law. Ruth reports to Naomi. Ruth still serves Naomi after a long day out. Although Ruth had been doing hard back-breaking work all day, she still makes a meal for Naomi. So ganun po katindi yung kanyang commitment kay Naomi. And Naomi observes that Ruth had someone shows her special favor. And then they decided that Ruth will keep gleaning from Boaz's field for the rest of the harvest. Naomi rightly concluded that Ruth would be safe there. So we will see in the coming chapters that Boaz is a type of Christ bilang Redeemer. So yun yung type kasi he redeemed Ruth ayon doon sa law of Redeemer. So mayroon kasing batas na sinusunod, at yun nga si Boaz yung isang type na kanyang ni-redeem si Ruth dahil siya ay may kakayanan at willing. Nandoon yung kanyang willingness to redeem. So Boaz loved Ruth. We can infer this from verse 10 naman. He interprets her willingness to marry him as kindness, while the closer relative may have considered Ruth a bother, a nuisance, or perhaps even worse, a leech. Boaz responds to her joyfully instead of looking down on her as a poor foreigner who would be a drain on his finances. Boaz loved her. Now we can begin to see that the heap's kindness he poured on her throughout the whole harvest seasons were perhaps not only motivated out of kindness to the poor, but was perhaps enhanced because of his love for her. So ganun po ang nangyari, no, yung history ni yung Ruth and Boaz, yung kanilang love story. At ulitin ko po yung story kung paano nagiging asawa ni Ruth si Boaz. Okay? At bakit napakahalaga na pwede nating pag-aralan ang book na ito, dahil ay mayroong relation o related doon sa pinanggalingan ng ating Panginoong Hesukristo. Okay po, so sana mayroon kayong natutunan na lesson dito sa Book of Ruth. Hanggang dito na lang ang ating presentation. Maraming salamat.